So it's currently 2025 and you're still afraid to deadlift. It's not functional, bro. There's still better substitute for hypertrophy.
Risk to reward ratio is a joke.
For deadlifts?
For deadlifts.
Really?
And
Never see what your body's capable of pulling weight off the floor at maximum load. Don't do it. It's just not worth it.
It is a shame for a man to grow old without seeing the beauty and strength of which his body is capable.
the risk to reward ratio is a joke.
But if you are interested, I'm going to tell you exactly how to go from not deadlifting at all to even deadlifting with very crappy technique in the past and learning how to correct for it so you can have a pretty good deadlift and to not make sure that you're going to Snap City on your way there. Now, the very first thing that you want to address before even starting deadlifts off the floor is to make sure that your hamstrings are not tight and that you have full range of motion. Now, the biggest issue why people have lumbar rounding when they're deadlifting is not only because of tight hamstrings, but also because of inactive and pretty weak hamstrings when it comes to any movement revolving around a hinge position. Now, this usually happens with the guy that does not do RDLs, does not train his legs, does not do hamstrings. I was one of those guys. And so when you get very strong at the deadlift and the hamstrings do not necessarily catch up with other parts like the glutes, the quads, lumbar strength, you're going to be bracing more of that training load with your lumbar as you get stronger if you do not address the weakest link in the chain, which is going to be hamstrings. Now, someone that used to deadlift with their lumbar, it's not necessarily meaning that you're going to get injured if you have a lumbar round when you're deadlifting. And the way I like to think about back injuries is that a disc herniation is like the core, and then you have different layers from that core, layers of defense before you get snapped up. So if this is your disc herniation, your lumbar rounding's right here, and then your thoracic and neutral spine rounding is here. And then maybe not deadlifting at all is right here or in here, because let's be honest, deadlifting is a pretty awesome movement. It does hit a lot of body parts and allows you to have axial loading for bone density. So that's a huge major reason why you would want to do it. You don't have to do it at maximal loads, but anyways, that's another discussion for another video. So in short, you can get away with lumbar rounding, but your risk of injury is high. So if you do not have a problem right now with having a little bit of lumbar rounding when you're deadlifting, do not just turn away from it and ignore the problem. There's a good chance that you either have weak hamstrings, poor positioning off the floor. Two of the same things, to be honest. If you have very tight hamstrings, you might not have the mobility to reach a comfortable position where you can start with a neutral spine, or even that of a thoracic round, rounding the upper back, which is not nearly as dangerous as having lumbar rounding. So how do you achieve less tight hamstrings? Do I just go in the gym, start static stretching, do a couple dynamic stretches, and boom, get into deadlifts? Whoa. You need to slow it down. It is a pretty complicated problem, and a lot of people think they're going to resolve their hamstring issues within 1 to 2 weeks. It's going to be a couple of months minimum. It's a mobilizing problem, meaning you need to achieve full range of motion, and it's also a muscle and strength problem, so it's going to take some time. And before deadlifting off the floor or doing any form of hinging movement like an RDL, you have to understand how to hinge and to understand that your hamstring mobility is something that you have to be very careful pushing. But like any other muscle group, something like stretch mediated hypertrophy does work with the hamstrings and will allow you to get stronger, bigger hamstrings and also achieve a greater range of motion in process of doing so. So before you even touch an RDL, which is going to be the cure to all tight hamstrings, understand that the hamstrings will get pre-lengthened when you have a hyperextended spine, meaning you'll have even less range of motion than if you're a neutral spine or a thoracic rounded spine. And if you're doing a hinge motion and your knees are moving forward, then you're probably not using the hamstrings and you're probably using more of the glutes. The knees should stay as much in place as they can, and the hips should go as far backwards with your spine either neutral or hyperextended to hit the hamstrings directly. If you've never done an RDL, you've never done any hamstring training, if you've never did any hamstring work in your life and it's your first day at the gym, start with laying hamstring curls, progress to seated hamstring curls, then you could start your first RDL.
If you're in the market for some supplements, I would highly recommend checking out Huge Supplements. They have the 100 serving creatine, correct pre, liquid glycerol. Be careful with glycerol, too much will make you use a washroom like a laxative. Just right out, you have some juicy ass pumps. Use code JUSTLEE to save 10% at checkout. Enjoy.
Now it's time you're ready to do your RDL, or you've done RDLs in the past and you had decent progression with RDLs. I need you to think about your RDL as two separate movements. One to build hamstrings and the other to be more specific for powerlifting and to build probably more glute than anything. We can call this our bodybuilding RDLs and our powerlifting specific RDLs. Bodybuilding RDLs are specifically going to be RDLs to train the hamstrings. Minimal knee flexion is what you want, a lot of hip flexion, and a hyperextended spine, all while controlling the eccentric, getting as deep as you can without causing any pain to your hamstrings, which is typically going to be the limiting factor when it comes to doing your bodybuilding RDLs. Be very careful with barbell RDLs. Your training loads can be extremely different, about 30% less in training max compared to your regular deadlift. I'm a decent deadlifter and I only maximally use 365 to 405 with bodybuilding RDLs because it's a heck of a lot of load to put on the hamstrings, and hamstrings are not my best body part, so don't ego lift with your hamstrings. Horrible injuries could happen with the hamstrings if you're not careful. I would say about 6 to 8 weeks of doing the barbell RDL for bodybuilding while focusing on progressing your range of motion, you're going to experience a lot of noob-like gains, but you're still not ready to touch barbell deadlifts off the floor. We need to build you a bridge from point A to point B. This is where something called Powerlifting RDLs is going to be very beneficial. So Powerlifting RDLs differs because we're not just focused on the hamstring hinge. We're gonna have a little bit more knee flexion. We're gonna get very close to the floor, and we're going to maybe not care nearly as much about the eccentric as we would with the bodybuilding RDLs. Since we're not focused on hamstring development nearly as much, a neutral spine or a thoracic round would suffice for this deadlift variation, as you're still going to target a ton of glutes and lumbar and upper back training, basically your whole posterior, compared to doing a bodybuilding version of the RDL where you're just going to be having the hamstrings as a main limiting factor in your deadlift. For the powerlifting RDL, it's very much similar to that of doing deadlifts off the floor. You get to take some of that old movement pattern from doing a bodybuilding RDL to the powerlifting RDL by still controlling some of the eccentric motion while going down the deadlift. As we all know, a lot of people do not even train the eccentric when it comes to deadlifting, which is why a lot of powerlifters have crappy hamstrings. And unlike the bodybuilding version of doing the RDLs, you can load a lot closer to your true training max with the powerlifting RDL. For myself, I can do about 90% of my training max off the floor. Still weaker because we're still controlling the eccentric, and the eccentric is a lot harder to control compared to just training the concentric form off the floor with traditional deadlifts. Now, if you have no idea whether you should thoracically round or not, and you have massive lumbar rounding, do not thoracically round. Learn how to deadlift with a neutral spine. Learn the two versions of the RDL that we explained in this video. And now, if you go through the course and you're able to perform a deadlift off the floor without lumbar rounding, now it's time to discuss whether you should improve your technique with thoracic rounding. If you're able to keep a neutral spine off the floor, but feels like you're bracing a lot of load on your hips and it's starting to feel like a little bit of a squat, but you're able to maintain a neutral spine, now the thoracic round should be introduced to kind of learn how to pull off the floor at different hip heights. Because we have decent hamstring strength, because we have some experience at this point with keeping a neutral spine in the deadlift, you'll be able to pinpoint what feels off and what feels decent at maintaining lumbar neutral while keeping an upper thoracic spine rounded. Now, to add on to neutral pulling versus thoracic pulling, if you pull with a neutral spine, you should really spend a lot more time pulling slack out of the setup. If you pull with a thoracic round, you might find it a lot easier to skip the slack pull and to explode off the floor, like Pete Rubish, like myself. But that does not mean you should not pull slack off the floor when it comes to deadlifting. Slack pull is a huge topic for another video, but in short, training back downs, training certain training days with slack pulls, even if you're not a slack puller, will pay massive dividends in keeping a more consistent start off the floor, prevent missed groups, and prevent awkward lumbar rounding, which a lot of people experience and often gets them injured, resulting in them not wanting to deadlift ever in their life. And to be fair, there's a lot more that I haven't mentioned. You could also do stiff leg deadlifts as an in-between from powerlifting RDLs to stiff legs to conventional deadlift RDLs. But as long as you start deadlifting with powerlifting RDLs, you can start off-floor deadlifting at the same time, and you could learn the movement pattern simultaneously. Just make sure you're choosing loads that your body can handle and recover from and are still sub-max for at least 4 to 6 weeks. Now, if you want to sign up for coaching, I do have coaching. Here's some coaching progression of my clients. I do have a couple more spots available. If you're interested in what we talked about in this video and you feel like some of this stuff might apply to you, we can work on more hands-on. Make sure to apply in the bio. Use code JUSTLEE for YoungLA. It'll save you 15%. And thank you everyone that used my huge supplements code. JUSTLEE. Please DM me your order if you do decide to buy anything. Peace.